The dust storm rolled over the horizon like a tidal wave, consuming everything in its path as Grace Novak rode desperately through the unforgiving Texas landscape of 1875. Her horse, already exhausted from the grueling journey, stumbled beneath her as fever clouded her vision and dried her throat to sandpaper. The wagon train she had been traveling with was 3 days behind her, or perhaps they were all dead now. Grace couldn't be certain of anything except the burning in her veins and the dizzying spin of the world around her. The infection had started in a small cut on her palm 4 days earlier. By yesterday morning, angry red lines had begun creeping up her arm, and the other women in the wagon train had whispered words like blood poisoning and gangrene when they thought she couldn't hear. But Grace had heard, and she'd made her decision. Better to ride ahead to the settlement marked on their maps than to burden the already struggling group with her care. Now, as consciousness slipped from her grasp like water through fingers, Grace wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The horse beneath her whinnied and came to a halt, refusing to move farther into the wall of dust bearing down upon them. Grace's feverish mind registered the sound of hoofbeats approaching just before she slid sideways from the saddle, the ground rising up to meet her with unforgiving force. Strong arms caught her before she hit the earth. Through the haze of dust and fever, Grace gazed up at a face half hidden beneath a bandana and the wide brim of a hat. A man's voice rumbled, deep and steady as a mountain stream. "You'll wake up to a better morning," the cowboy said, gathering her against his chest as the world faded to black. The sensation of cool water against her lips roused Grace from unconsciousness. She struggled to open her eyes, finding them crusted shut with dust and sweat. When she finally managed to pry them open, a room swam into fuzzy focus, rough-hewn log walls, a small window letting in pale morning light, and a man sitting beside the bed she lay in. "Easy now," he said, setting down a tin cup. "You've been fighting quite a battle." Grace tried to speak, but produced only a dry rasp. The man helped her take another sip of water before settling back in his chair. With her vision clearing, Grace could see him properly for the first time. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with a face weathered by sun and wind. His eyes, a striking shade of blue against his tanned skin, watched her with careful concern. "Who?" she managed. "Caleb Nolan," he replied. "This is my homestead. Found you about to be swallowed up by that dust storm 2 days back. You've been out with fever ever since." Grace attempted to sit up, but weakness forced her back down. 2 days? Near enough. Your arm was badly infected. I've been treating it with poultices my ma taught me to make. Seems to be working, but you're not out of danger yet. Memories flooded back the wagon train, her decision to ride ahead, the pain spreading through her body. Grace glanced down at her right arm, now wrapped in clean bandages where the angry red streaks had been. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how to repay you." A half smile crossed his face. "No need for talk of payment, Miss Grace Novak. Miss Novak, you just focus on healing. Winter's coming, and these parts get mighty unforgiving when the snow falls." Grace wanted to ask more questions, but exhaustion pulled at her once again. As she drifted back to sleep, she heard Caleb Nolan moving about the cabin, the sound oddly comforting in her vulnerable state. The next time Grace woke, shadows had lengthened across the cabin floor. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the aroma of something savory made her stomach rumble. She found she could sit up this time, though the effort left her dizzy. Caleb appeared in the doorway, carrying a steaming bowl. He seemed surprised to see her upright. "Well now, that's a good sign. Hungry?" "Starving," Grace admitted. He approached and set the bowl on a small table beside the bed. "Rabbit stew. Nothing fancy, but it'll put strength back in you." As he helped her adjust her position to eat, Grace became acutely aware that she was wearing only a long cotton nightshirt that wasn't her own. Heat flooded her cheeks. "Your clothes were soaked through with sweat," Caleb explained, seeming to read her thoughts. "Mrs. Hollister from the next homestead came over and tended to you. She left some of her daughter's things for when you're well enough." Relief washed over Grace. "I'm sorry to be such a burden." "No burden," he said simply. watching as she took her first spoonful of stew. "How's your arm feeling?" Grace glanced at the bandages. The fierce pain had subsided to a dull throb. "Better, I think." "Good. The infection's retreating." He settled into the chair beside her bed. "Mind telling me what a woman was doing riding alone through these parts?" Between spoonfuls of the surprisingly delicious stew, Grace explained about the wagon train heading to settle near Fort Griffin, about the cut she'd received helping repair a broken wheel, and about her decision to ride ahead when the infection set in. "Didn't want to slow them down," she concluded. "There were children who needed the medicine more than I did." Caleb's expression was unreadable. That was either very brave or very foolish. "Perhaps both," Grace admitted. "Your wagon train is likely at Fort Griffin by now. Once you're stronger, I can take you there." Grace set down her spoon, suddenly remembering the contents of her saddlebags. "My horse, did you find her? There were letters, important documents. Your mare is fine, resting in the stable, and your belongings are safe," he assured her, including a packet of letters tied with blue ribbon that seemed important. Relief flooded through her. Those letters were all she had left of her parents, her only connection to the life she'd left behind in Boston after their deaths had left her penniless and alone. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "You've saved more than just my life, Mr. Nolan." "Caleb," he corrected. "Out here, formalities don't count for much." Grace nodded, feeling the exhaustion returning despite her brief burst of energy. Caleb took the half-finished bowl from her hands. "Rest now," he said. "You've got color in your cheeks that wasn't there yesterday. I'd say you really will wake up to a better morning tomorrow." The quiet assurance in his voice followed Grace into her dreams. True to Caleb's prediction, Grace woke the next morning feeling markedly improved. Sunlight streamed through the small window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. For the first time, she took proper stock of her surroundings. The cabin was small but tidy, with the main room serving as kitchen, dining area, and living space. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, various tools and cooking implements hanging nearby. The bed she occupied was in a small alcove, partially separated from the main space by a worn curtain currently pulled back. Simple furnishings, a table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair near the fire, and shelves holding books and supplies completed the space. Grace was contemplating attempting to stand when the door opened and Caleb entered, carrying an armful of firewood. He stopped short when he saw her awake. "Morning," he said, depositing the wood in a box by the hearth. "You're looking better." "Feeling it too," Grace replied. "I think I might try standing today." Caleb approached, studying her face critically. "Fever's gone, but you've lost strength. Let me help you." With his support, Grace managed to swing her legs over the edge of the bed. The simple movement left her embarrassingly winded. When she tried to stand, her legs trembled like a newborn colt's. "Easy," Caleb murmured, his arm firm around her waist. "No rush." Grace's frustration must have shown on her face because he added, "Blood poisoning takes a toll. You're recovering faster than most would." After a few tentative steps, Grace had to admit defeat and allow Caleb to help her back to bed. "I feel useless," she confessed. "You've been at death's door," he reminded her. "Give yourself time." He hesitated, then said, "I've sent word to Fort Griffin about you. Expecting a reply in a day or two." Grace nodded, grateful for his foresight. "What is this place exactly? Are we far from the fort?" "My homestead. Been working this land for 5 years now. We're about 2 days' ride from the fort, just south of the Clear Fork of the Brazos." He gestured toward the window. "Got 40 acres, most planted in wheat, though I keep some cattle too." "You live here alone?" The question slipped out before Grace could consider its propriety. If Caleb was offended, he didn't show it. "Just me. Had a partner when I first claimed the land, my cousin. He went back east 2 years ago. Said Texas was too wild for his taste." A shadow passed across his face. "Can't say I blame him sometimes." Before Grace could inquire further, a knock sounded at the door. Caleb went to answer it, admitting a round woman with gray-streaked hair who bustled in with a basket over her arm. "Ah, she's awake," the woman exclaimed. "Good morning, dear. I'm Martha Hollister. Been helping Caleb look after you. Mrs. Hollister is my nearest neighbor, Caleb explained. Lives about 3 miles east with her husband and daughter. Thank you for your help, Grace said sincerely. Think nothing of it, Martha replied, unpacking the basket to reveal fresh bread, a jar of preserves, and a bundle of clean cloth. I brought fresh bandages and some of my blackberry jam. Nothing heals the body like good food. While Martha rebandaged Grace's arm, commenting favorably on the healing wound, Caleb excused himself to tend to his morning chores. Mrs. Hollister took the opportunity to speak more freely. He's a good man, that Caleb Nolan, she said in a low voice. Rode through that dust storm to get you to safety when anyone else would have hunkered down. Then sat by your bedside nearly 2 days straight, changing those poultices every few hours. Grace glanced toward the door Caleb had disappeared through. I owe him my life. That you do, Martha finished securing the bandage. Not many single men would take in a strange woman, especially one as pretty as you. But Caleb, he's different, always has been. Different how? Grace found herself curious about the solitary cowboy who had rescued her. Martha considered her words carefully. He keeps to himself mostly, but he's always the first to help when someone's in trouble. Lost his parents young, raised by his uncle back in Missouri. Came out here to make his own way. She lowered her voice further. There was a young lady once, about 3 years back. Schoolteacher from Austin. Things seemed serious, but she couldn't handle the isolation out here. Left him just before winter set in. Grace absorbed this information, feeling a strange twinge of sympathy for Caleb Nolan. She understood isolation all too well, the loneliness that had driven her to join the wagon train heading west, seeking not just a new home, but a sense of belonging she'd lost when her parents died. Your wagon train, Martha said, changing the subject. The Sullivan party, headed for the new settlement? Yes, Grace confirmed. Do you know of them? Martha nodded. Word came yesterday. They arrived at Fort Griffin 4 days ago. All safe, though they were worried about you. Caleb sent a rider to let them know you're here. Relief flooded through Grace. The families she'd traveled with for nearly 2 months had become something like friends. When I'm stronger, I should join them. Martha's expression grew thoughtful. Winter's coming fast this year. Might be safer to wait until spring. At Grace's alarmed look, she added, You'd be welcome with us if staying with a bachelor makes you uncomfortable, though I suspect Caleb would miss the company. The door opened before Grace could respond, and Caleb returned, stamping snow from his boots. Starting to come down out there, he announced. First snow of the season. Martha clucked her tongue. Earlier than usual. I'd best get back before it worsens. She gathered her things and patted Grace's hand. I'll return in a few days, dear. Rest and eat well. After seeing Martha out, Caleb brought a cup of steaming coffee to Grace. Mrs. Hollister tell you about your wagon train? Grace nodded. Yes, thank you for sending word. Weather's turning faster than expected, he said, glancing toward the window where snowflakes were now visible against the glass. Trail to Fort Griffin will be difficult for a few weeks at least. Mrs. Hollister suggested I might winter here, Grace said carefully, watching his reaction. Caleb's face remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. That would be sensible. You're welcome to stay until you're fully recovered and the weather clears. He hesitated. I know it's not proper, but I owe you my life, Mr. Nolan, Grace interrupted. I trust your character. And I've imposed enough that propriety seems a secondary concern now. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Still, we'll need to make arrangements. I can move my bedroll to the main room. I couldn't put you out of your bed any longer. You're not fully healed, he said firmly. And winter nights here get cold enough to freeze a person in their sleep. The alcove is warmer. The practical concerns of her situation were becoming clear to Grace. She was essentially stranded with this man until spring, or at least until the worst of winter passed. The realization should have frightened her, but strangely, it didn't. Something about Caleb Nolan's steady presence inspired trust. I want to earn my keep, she said, once I'm stronger. Caleb nodded, seeming to understand her need for independence. Fair enough. Can you cook? Yes. Quite well, actually. "Then we have an arrangement," he said, extending his hand as if to seal a business deal. Grace took it, noting the rough calluses against her softer palm. "An arrangement," she agreed. Outside, the snow fell thicker, blanketing the Texas plain in white. The next 2 weeks passed in a rhythm that became increasingly comfortable. Grace's strength returned gradually, allowing her to move about the cabin and eventually help with simple tasks. Caleb showed infinite patience as she regained her footing, never commenting when she needed to rest or when simple chores took her twice as long as they should have. The first time Grace prepared a full meal venison stew with dumplings, the look of appreciative surprise on Caleb's face was worth the effort it had cost her still recovering body. "This is the best meal I've had in years," he declared, reaching for a second helping. Grace couldn't help the pleased flush that warmed her cheeks. "My mother insisted I learn to cook properly. She said a woman never knows when such skills might save her." "Wise woman," Caleb commented. "She was," Grace agreed, the familiar pang of loss softened somehow by the sharing of this memory. "She and my father both died of influenza 2 years ago. I was their only child." Caleb's eyes met hers across the table. "I lost mine to cholera when I was 14. Uncle raised me after, but it wasn't the same." The simple exchange opened a door between them. That evening, as snow pattered against the windows and wind whistled through the eaves, they sat before the fire. And Grace found herself telling Caleb about the life she'd left behind in Boston, the struggle to maintain her parents' modest home after their deaths, the eventual sale of the house when debts mounted, and finally, her decision to join the wagon train west when there was nothing left to keep her in the city of her birth. "I had teaching experience from helping at my mother's small school," she explained. "The Sullivan party needed a teacher for their children, and they offered passage in exchange for my services." "And now? What will you do when you reach Fort Griffin?" Caleb asked, stoking the fire. Grace watched the sparks rise up the chimney. "Continue teaching, I suppose. Mrs. Sullivan said the settlement is building a proper schoolhouse by spring." Caleb nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Teaching's important work. These frontier children deserve education as much as any city child." Something in his tone made Grace curious. "You value education highly." A slight smile crossed his face. "My uncle was a schoolmaster. Made sure I read the classics even while teaching me to mend fences and brand cattle." He gestured toward the small bookshelf. "Brought my favorites west with me." Grace had noticed the book's well-worn volumes of Shakespeare, Twain, and several scientific texts on agriculture. Another piece of the puzzle that was Caleb Nolan fell into place. "You're not what I expected a Texas rancher to be," she admitted. He chuckled, the sound warm in the firelit room. "And what did you expect, Miss Novak?" "I'm not entirely sure," she replied honestly. "Someone rougher, perhaps, less civilized," he supplied with a raised eyebrow. "That's not what I meant," she protested. Then, seeing the amusement in his eyes, realized he was teasing her. It was the first time she'd seen this lighter side of him. "The West attracts all types," he said more seriously. "Some running from something, others running toward something. I came looking for land and independence. Others came for less noble reasons." "And which am I?" Grace asked. "Running from or toward?" Caleb studied her for a long moment. "Both, I'd wager. Same as most of us." His perception was uncomfortably accurate. Grace had indeed been fleeing the painful memories and reduced circumstances of her life in Boston. But she had also been drawn west by the promise of a fresh start, of building something meaningful in a place where her past didn't define her. "You're right," she acknowledged softly. They sat in companionable silence as the fire burned lower. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the cabin, Grace felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames before them. As December deepened, the snow piled high around the cabin. Caleb spent hours each day clearing paths to the barn and outbuildings, checking on his livestock, and bringing in firewood. Grace's recovery accelerated, and soon she was handling all the indoor tasks, cooking, cleaning, mending Caleb's work shirts that showed signs of bachelor neglect. Martha Hollister visited when weather permitted, bringing news, supplies, and not-so-subtle observations about how well Grace and Caleb seemed to be getting along. On her third visit, she brought a letter that had arrived from Fort Griffin. "It's from Mrs. Sullivan," Grace said excitedly, breaking the seal. Her eyes scanned the contents quickly. "They're all well settled. The men have begun building cabins, and they've established good relations with the fort." She continued reading, then looked up with a mix of emotions. "They're holding a teaching position for me, but understand if I can't travel until spring." "Good news, then," Caleb said, his tone carefully neutral as he stoked the fire. "Yes," Grace agreed, though she felt an unexpected reluctance at the reminder that her stay here was temporary. That evening, after Martha had departed and they had finished supper, Caleb brought out a worn chess set. "Thought you might enjoy a game," he said, almost shyly. "Evenings get long in winter." Grace smiled. "My father taught me to play. I'm rather good, I should warn you." Caleb's eyes crinkled at the corners. "We'll see about that." The game became a nightly tradition. Grace discovered that Caleb played with the same thoughtful deliberation he applied to everything else. He won their first match, but Grace took the second, leading to good-natured competition that often extended late into the evening. It was during one such game, with December's full moon casting silver light through the windows to complement the golden glow of the oil lamps, that Grace realized something had fundamentally changed. Somewhere between fever dreams and chess matches, between learning to bake bread in Caleb's Dutch oven and watching him gentle a skittish colt in the barn, she had developed feelings for this quiet, complicated man. The realization struck her as she contemplated her next move on the chessboard. Caleb sat across from her, brow furrowed in concentration, the lamplight playing across the planes of his face. When he looked up and caught her staring, Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Your move," he reminded her softly. Grace forced her attention back to the game, making a careless move that cost her a bishop. Caleb raised an eyebrow, but didn't comment as he captured the piece. Later, as she lay in bed listening to Caleb's steady breathing from his bedroll near the fire, Grace tried to impose reason on her emotions. She would be leaving come spring. Her path was set toward Fort Griffin and the teaching position awaiting her. Becoming attached to Caleb Nolan and his solitary homestead was impractical at best, heartbreaking at worst. Yet as winter's grip tightened around the small cabin, bringing them into closer proximity and deeper conversation, Grace found it increasingly difficult to maintain emotional distance. December gave way to January, bringing a bitter cold snap that forced even Caleb to admit they were experiencing an unusually harsh winter. The temperature dropped so severely that he moved his bedroll into the alcove next to Grace's bed, a heavy curtain between them, their only concession to propriety. "If the fire dies in the night, we could both freeze," he explained matter-of-factly. "Body heat's the next best thing to a good blaze." Grace understood the practical necessity, but the awareness of him sleeping just feet away kept her awake long into the night. She could hear each shift of his body, each deep breath. Once, she thought she heard him whisper her name in his sleep, but convinced herself it was merely the wind playing tricks. January brought another visitor, a Tonkawa man named Joseph, who occasionally worked for Caleb and had become something of a friend. He arrived bearing news and supplies from Fort Griffin. "Army's battened down," he reported as they shared coffee at Caleb's table. "Comanche raided a settlement north of here last week." Caleb's expression darkened. "Anyone hurt?" "2 men killed, a woman taken. Army's tracking them, but with this weather." Joseph shook his head grimly. Grace shivered, suddenly reminded of the dangers that existed beyond their isolated haven. Caleb must have noticed her reaction, because he quickly changed the subject, asking Joseph about conditions on the trail to Fort Griffin. "Impossible for at least another month," Joseph confirmed, "unless you're desperate or a fool." When Joseph departed the next morning, he left behind newspapers, coffee, sugar, and to Grace's delight, several books from Fort Griffin's small lending library. Joseph's mother was Cherokee, his father Mexican, Caleb explained after their visitor had gone. "He walks between worlds not fully accepted by whites, Tonkawa, or Comanche." Makes him a good mediator, though. He seems to respect you, Grace observed. We understand each other, Caleb said simply. Both of us are outsiders in our own ways. The comment stayed with Grace. She began to see how Caleb's educated background and thoughtful nature might set him apart from many frontier settlers, just as her Eastern upbringing marked her as different. January crawled toward February, and life settled into a pattern that began to feel like normalcy. Grace's arm had healed completely, leaving only a faint scar to remind her of the infection that had nearly taken her life. Her strength fully returned. She took on more responsibilities around the homestead, not just cooking and cleaning, but helping Caleb with the livestock when weather permitted. She discovered she enjoyed working alongside him, learning the rhythms of ranch life. Caleb proved to be a patient teacher, explaining the intricacies of animal husbandry, crop rotation, and weather prediction with the same clarity he brought to their evening discussions of literature and philosophy. "You'd make a fine teacher yourself," Grace observed one evening as he explained the principles behind his irrigation system. Caleb looked surprised. "Never thought of it that way." "Why did you choose ranching?" she asked. "With your education, you could have pursued many paths." He was silent for a long moment, gazing into the fire. "Wanted land of my own," he finally said, "something that couldn't be taken away. After my parents died, my uncle was good to me, but I was always aware of living on his charity." He glanced around the simple cabin. "It's not much compared to Eastern standards, but every board, every nail is mine. There's peace in that." Grace understood completely. "It's a good life you've built here." "Most of the time," he agreed. "Gets lonely, though." The admission seemed to surprise him as much as her. Before she could respond, a violent gust of wind rattled the windows, drawing their attention back to the storm that had been building all day. Caleb rose to check that the shutters were secured. "Worst blizzard yet," he commented, returning to the fire. "Glad we brought extra firewood in this morning." They sat close together for warmth as the temperature in the cabin dropped despite the blazing hearth. When it came time for bed, Grace found herself reluctant to leave the fire's immediate heat. Caleb noticed her shivering. "Take my buffalo robe," he offered, retrieving the heavy fur from a chest. "It's the warmest thing I own." "What about you?" Grace protested. "I'll manage." The stubborn set of his jaw told her argument was useless. That night, buried under blankets and the buffalo robe, Grace still couldn't get warm. Her teeth chattered audibly in the darkness, and she could hear Caleb shifting restlessly on his side of the curtain. "Grace?" His voice was hesitant. "Are you all right?" "Jay just sea cold," she managed. A long pause, then, "This is dangerous weather. People die on nights like this." Another pause, longer this time. "I'm going to suggest something improper, but it's about survival, not propriety." Grace understood immediately what he was suggesting. Heat flooded her cheeks even as another violent shiver racked her body. Survival trumped modesty. "Yes," she whispered. The curtain rustled, and then Caleb was sliding under the buffalo robe beside her, keeping a careful distance but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. They lay stiffly side by side, both fully clothed, both acutely aware of the line they were crossing. "Better?" he asked, his voice sounding strained. "Yes," she admitted, already feeling warmth returning to her extremities. "Thank you." "Try to sleep," he murmured. "Storm should pass by morning." Gradually, exhaustion overcame awkwardness. Grace found herself drifting closer to Caleb's warmth, and in the hazy space between waking and sleeping, she felt his arm tentatively encircle her. She didn't pull away. When Grace woke the next morning, pale winter sunlight was filtering through the window, and she was alone in the bed. The storm had passed, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. She found Caleb already dressed and building up the fire, his back to her as she emerged from the alcove. "Morning," she said tentatively. He turned, his expression unreadable. "Morning. Storm broke about dawn. Need to check the livestock." His tone was carefully neutral, as if nothing unusual had transpired between them. "Caleb," Grace began, but he cut her off. "We did what was necessary," he said firmly. "No need to speak of it." But something had changed between them, like a door cracked open that couldn't be fully closed again. Though they returned to their separate sleeping arrangements the following night, Grace found herself hyper-aware of Caleb's proximity, of the way his hand sometimes lingered near hers when passing a dish at supper, of the softening in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. February brought a brief thaw that allowed Martha Hollister to visit again, this time with her daughter Emily. The girl was about 17, pretty and vivacious, clearly delighted to have new company. "We've heard so much about you, Miss Novak," Emily gushed as they sat around Caleb's table. "Everyone's talking about the Eastern lady staying with Bachelor Nolan." "Emily," her mother admonished, though Grace didn't miss the speculative glance Martha cast between her and Caleb. "I hope they're not saying anything improper," Grace said lightly. "Mr. Nolan has been a perfect gentleman." "Oh, of course," Emily assured her. "In fact, most folks are saying it's high time Caleb found himself a wife, and maybe Providence sent you his way." "Emily," Martha's tone was sharper this time, "you'll embarrass our hosts." Grace felt her cheeks burning and didn't dare look at Caleb, who had suddenly become very interested in his coffee cup. The awkward moment was broken when Joseph arrived unexpectedly, stamping snow from his boots as he entered without knocking, apparently a common enough occurrence that neither Caleb nor the Hollisters seemed surprised. "Riders coming," he announced without preamble. "From Fort Griffin, 2 men, 1 woman." Caleb stood immediately. "How far?" "About an hour, moving slow in the snow." Martha rose as well. "We should go. Emily, gather your things." "But we just got here," the girl protested. "It's not proper for us to be here when strangers arrive," Martha explained firmly. "Besides, your father will be expecting us." As the Hollisters prepared to leave, Grace felt a strange anxiety building. Visitors from Fort Griffin could mean only one thing: someone had come for her. The realization should have brought joy, but instead, she felt something close to dread. Caleb must have sensed her unease because he touched her arm lightly as they stood at the door, watching the Hollisters depart. "Might just be travelers passing through," he said. Grace shook her head. "In February? On this trail?" "They've come about me." He didn't contradict her, which was confirmation enough. The hour that followed was tense. Grace changed into her best dress, one of Emily Hollister's, that Martha had altered to fit her. She brushed her hair until it shone and pinched color into her pale cheeks. All the while, her mind raced with conflicting emotions. She should be grateful that someone had braved winter trails to escort her to Fort Griffin. Her future lay there: the teaching position, the community of the wagon train she'd traveled with. Yet the prospect of leaving Caleb's homestead filled her with an unexpected sorrow. When hoofbeats finally sounded outside, Grace was sitting composed by the fire, while Caleb stood at the window, watching the riders approach. "Sullivan's son," he reported, "and his wife." "Third rider is a woman I don't recognize." Grace's heart leaped. "Anna Sullivan came herself? In this weather?" The door opened before Caleb could answer, admitting a blast of cold air and 3 snow-covered figures. As they removed hats and scarves, Grace recognized Thomas Sullivan and his wife Anna, who had been among the leaders of the wagon train. The third visitor was an older woman with a stern countenance, dressed in practical but clearly expensive traveling clothes. "Miss Novak," Thomas said, smiling broadly, "thank the Lord you're alive and well." Anna rushed forward to embrace Grace. "We've been so worried when your horse returned without you." "Mr. Nolan found me," Grace explained, gesturing toward Caleb, who stood somewhat awkwardly by the fireplace. "He saved my life." Thomas stepped forward, extending his hand to Caleb. "We're in your debt, sir. Grace is dear to all of us." Caleb shook the offered hand. "She would have done the same for any of us." The older woman cleared her throat pointedly, and Thomas startled. "Oh, allow me to introduce Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove. She's come from Austin to interview for the teaching position at our settlement." Grace felt as if the floor had dropped from beneath her. "Interview? But I thought—" Anna looked uncomfortable. "We hoped you would take the position, of course, but with no word except that you were ill." she trailed off apologetically. The children need consistency, Mrs. Hargrove interjected, speaking for the first time. Her voice was as precise and formal as her appearance. I have 20 years teaching experience in established schools. The settlement committee felt they couldn't delay decisions about education until spring. Grace struggled to maintain her composure. Of course, that's perfectly sensible. An awkward silence fell until Caleb broke it. You must be tired from your journey. Please sit, I'll prepare coffee. As he busied himself at the stove, the Sullivans explained their presence. We came to check on you primarily, Thomas said, but also to escort you back if you're well enough to travel. Mrs. Hargrove accompanied us because she wanted to see the region before committing to the position. The weather's breaking, Anna added hopefully. Joseph says the trail should be passable for the next few days at least. Grace nodded mechanically, trying to process this unexpected turn of events. The teaching position that had been her anchor, her reason for pressing forward, was slipping away. And now she was being asked to leave the place that had become a sanctuary, to leave Caleb. The thought brought her up short. When had she begun thinking of staying? Grace? Anna's concerned voice broke through her thoughts. Are you well enough to travel? You look pale. I'm fully recovered, Grace assured her, thanks to Mr. Nolan's care. Then you'll return with us? Thomas pressed. We've missed you terribly, and there's plenty for you to do at the settlement, even without the teaching position. Before Grace could respond, Caleb returned with the coffee. As he served their guests, his eyes met Grace's briefly, and in them she saw a carefully masked emotion that mirrored the turmoil in her own heart. Where would I live? Grace asked, turning back to the Sullivans. I had counted on the teacher's quarters. With us, of course, Anna said quickly, until you establish your own situation. The hesitation was telling. They expected her to marry as most single women did on the frontier. It was the practical solution to her circumstance: find a husband among the settlement's single men, most of whom would welcome an educated, attractive wife. The conversation continued around her as Grace's mind raced. Mrs. Hargrove dominated the discussion, expounding on her educational philosophy and questioning Thomas about the settlement's resources. Caleb said little, but Grace was acutely aware of his presence across the room, solid and steady as always. We should rest before our return journey, Thomas finally said. We hope to start back tomorrow if the weather holds. You're welcome to stay the night, Caleb offered. It'll be tight quarters, but better than camping in February. Arrangements were made for the night the Sullivans would sleep in the alcove, Mrs. Hargrove would take Grace's bed, and Grace would sleep near the fire alongside Caleb, with propriety maintained by the presence of their guests. As darkness fell and the visitors retired, Grace found herself alone with Caleb for the first time since they had arrived. They stood by the fire, voices lowered to avoid disturbing their sleeping guests. You don't have to go, Caleb said quietly, surprising her with his directness. Grace's heart thundered in her chest. What would I do here? Whatever you want. He met her gaze steadily. Teach my neighbor's children. Help me with the ranch. Build a life. The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Are you asking me to stay as your housekeeper, Caleb? Or as something else? Grace needed clarity, needed to hear him say the words that would make her choice clear. Caleb took a deep breath. I'm asking you to stay as my wife, if you'll have me. The directness of it, the simple honesty, stole Grace's breath. This was not a proposal born of convenience or necessity, like so many frontier marriages. In Caleb's eyes, she saw genuine feeling and fear that she would reject him. We've known each other such a short time, she whispered, though her heart was already answering yes. I knew the first night you beat me at chess, he replied with the ghost of a smile. You challenged me, surprised me, made me laugh. No woman's done that since. He stopped, then continued more softly. I never expected to find someone like you, Grace, especially not half dead in a dust storm. Despite the gravity of the moment, Grace couldn't help but smile at that. Not the most romantic beginning to a courtship. No, he agreed, reaching for her hand. But I meant what I said when I found you. You did wake up to a better morning, and I want to give you a lifetime of better mornings if you'll let me. Grace looked down at their joined hands, his large and work-roughened, hers smaller but no longer soft after months of frontier living. They fit together well, those hands, like they belonged together. "What about Fort Griffin?" she asked, though she already knew her answer. "The Sullivans expect me to return with them." "It's your decision," Caleb said. "I won't keep you if your heart lies elsewhere." Grace thought of the settlement waiting at Fort Griffin, the community she'd traveled with, the security of established society. Then she thought of this homestead, of the quiet evenings by the fire with Caleb, of the life they might build together. "My heart doesn't lie elsewhere," she said softly. "I think perhaps it's been here for some time. I just didn't recognize it." Joy transformed Caleb's face, erasing the worry lines that had etched themselves there since their visitor's arrival. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Tomorrow," he promised, "I'll speak to Sullivan properly. Do this right." Grace nodded, happiness bubbling up inside her like a spring. Tomorrow. They stood together by the dying fire, hands entwined, the promise of tomorrow bright between them. Morning brought clarity and courage. As the Sullivans and Mrs. Hargrove prepared for departure, Grace announced her decision to stay. Anna's surprise quickly gave way to knowing smiles, while Thomas looked between Grace and Caleb with dawning understanding. "I see," he said, a twinkle in his eye. "Providence works in mysterious ways." Mrs. Hargrove seemed merely relieved that the teaching position would definitely be hers. She offered stiff congratulations when Caleb formally requested permission to court Grace, with the intention of marriage a formality he insisted on, though the Sullivans had no real authority over Grace's decisions. "Spring wedding?" Anna suggested as they prepared to leave. "We could all return for the celebration." Grace looked to Caleb, who nodded. "Spring would be perfect," she agreed. "The land will be waking up then." "Much like you were when I found you," Caleb murmured, for her ears alone. As they watched their visitors disappear down the snow-covered trail, Caleb's arm slipped around Grace's waist. "Any regrets?" he asked. Grace leaned against his solid strength. "None," she said truthfully. "This feels right in a way nothing has since my parents died." He turned her to face him, his eyes searching hers. "I'll do everything in my power to make you happy here." "I know you will," she replied, "and I'll do the same for you." Caleb's hand came up to cup her cheek. "May I kiss you, Grace Novak?" "I've been wanting to since you beat me at chess that first time." Grace laughed softly. "I've been waiting for you to ask." Their first kiss was gentle, a promise of deeper passion to come. When they broke apart, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "Welcome home," he whispered. "Home," Grace repeated, savoring the word. After years of feeling adrift, she had found her anchor in this man and this land. "Yes, I believe it is." Spring arrived in a riot of wildflowers and green grass, transforming the stark winter landscape into a painter's dream. The wedding was set for early May, when the weather would be most reliable for guests traveling from Fort Griffin and surrounding homesteads. Martha Hollister took charge of preparations with military precision, enlisting her daughter and neighboring women to help Grace create a wedding dress from fine fabric ordered all the way from Dallas. The simple white gown, adorned with lace that Martha had been saving for her own daughter's wedding someday, brought tears to Grace's eyes when she first tried it on. "You look beautiful," Martha declared, stepping back to admire her work. "Caleb won't know what hit him." The courtship period had been both wonderful and frustrating. Wonderful in the growing certainty that she had made the right choice, frustrating in the propriety they maintained, even while living under the same roof. Martha had offered to have Grace stay with the Hollisters until the wedding, but neither Grace nor Caleb wanted that separation after the closeness they had developed during winter. Instead, Joseph moved into the cabin temporarily, his presence serving as chaperone while Caleb slept in the barn. It was an arrangement that satisfied convention while allowing Grace and Caleb to continue building their relationship through daily interaction. Spring brought increased activity on the homestead. Fields needed planting, cattle required attention after the harsh winter, and preparations for married life demanded changes to the cabin itself. Caleb worked from dawn to dusk, expanding the alcove into a proper bedroom and adding a small second room that could serve as either a parlor or someday a nursery. The thought of children made Grace both nervous and excited. She had always wanted a family of her own, but the frontier was a challenging place to raise children. When she voiced these concerns to Caleb one evening as they sat on the newly built front porch, he took her hands in his. "My mother used to say that love makes a safe harbor even in the stormiest seas," he told her. "Our children will have that harbor, Grace, I promise you." The simple sincerity of his words calmed her fears. Together, they would face whatever challenges came their way. 2 days before the wedding, the first guests arrived from Fort Griffin. The Sullivans came, along with several families from the wagon train who had become dear friends during their journey west. Even Mrs. Hargrove made the trip, her stern countenance softening somewhat when she saw the obvious happiness between Grace and Caleb. "You've made a good choice, Miss Novak," she admitted stiffly. "Education is my calling, but for you, perhaps this life is better suited." The morning of the wedding dawned clear and mild, as if nature itself approved of the union. The ceremony would take place outdoors, near the small creek that ran through Caleb's property, where wildflowers grew in abundance. Martha and Emily had created an arch of twisted branches and spring blooms under which the couple would exchange their vows. As Grace dressed in the Hollister's wagon, which had been set up as a temporary dressing room, she felt a curious calm. There were no last-minute doubts, no nervous second thoughts. When Anna Sullivan came to tell her it was time, Grace was ready. Caleb waited beneath the arch, looking uncharacteristically nervous in his best suit. But when he saw Grace approaching on Thomas Sullivan's arm, standing in for her father, his expression transformed to one of such joy and wonder that Grace felt tears pricking at her eyes. The ceremony was simple but meaningful. They exchanged vows before a circuit preacher who had arrived with the Fort Griffin contingent, promising to love and honor each other for all their days. When Caleb slipped his mother's ring onto Grace's finger, a treasured heirloom he had kept safe all these years, she felt the weight of history and promise it represented. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher declared to cheers from the assembled guests. Caleb's kiss was tender, but held a hint of the passion they had both restrained during their courtship. When they turned to face their friends as Mr. and Mrs. Nolan, Grace felt a sense of rightness that confirmed every choice that had led her to this moment. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with food, music, and dancing under the stars. As night fell, lanterns were lit around the homestead, creating pools of golden light in which couples twirled to fiddle music. Grace danced with Caleb, then with Thomas Sullivan and other male guests, before returning to her husband's arms for the final dance. "Happy, Mrs. Nolan?" Caleb murmured against her ear as they swayed together. "Completely," she assured him, leaning into his embrace. "And you?" "More than I ever thought possible." His arms tightened around her. "I keep thinking about that day I found you in the dust storm, how close I came to not riding out." "But you did," Grace reminded him, "and promised me I'd wake to a better morning." "I intend to keep that promise," Caleb said softly, "every day for the rest of our lives." As the guests began to depart, some to make camp nearby, others to return to neighboring homesteads, Grace and Caleb stood arm in arm on their porch, accepting well wishes and watching the lantern lights recede into the distance. Finally, they were alone. Caleb swept Grace into his arms to carry her across the threshold of their home, now truly theirs together. The cabin, scrubbed and decorated for the occasion, seemed transformed in the soft lamplight. "Welcome home, Mrs. Nolan," Caleb said, setting her gently on her feet but keeping his arms around her. Grace reached up to touch his face, still somewhat amazed that this good man was now her husband. "Home," she agreed. "It has such a wonderful sound." Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Grace thought about the journey that had brought her to this place, the tragedy of losing her parents, the desperate decision to travel west, the infection that nearly claimed her life. All of it had led her here, to Caleb's arms. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his voice drowsy as he traced patterns on her bare shoulder. "About fate," she replied. "Do you believe in it?" Caleb considered the question. "I believe that life offers us moments of choice, crossroads. What matters is which path we take when we reach them." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I'm grateful every day that my path crossed with yours." "Even though I arrived half dead and delirious," Grace teased. "Especially then," he said with mock seriousness, "gave me a chance to demonstrate my nursing skills and impress you." Grace laughed softly. "Consider me thoroughly impressed, Mr. Nolan." Outside, a night bird called in the darkness. Inside, wrapped in each other's arms, Grace and Caleb Nolan began their life together. Secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them side by side. The years that followed brought both joy and hardship, as frontier life often did. Their first child, a son they named James after Caleb's father, arrived 11 months after their wedding. Grace's labor was difficult, and without Martha Hollister's experienced help, the outcome might have been tragic. But mother and child survived, and Caleb's face when he first held his son was a picture of wonder Grace would never forget. The ranch prospered under their joint care. Grace's organizational skills complemented Caleb's practical knowledge, and together they expanded their operations, adding more cattle and planting new crops. When neighboring homesteaders struggled during a drought in their third year of marriage, the Nolans were able to help, cementing their place as valued members of the growing community. Their second child, a daughter named Sarah after Grace's mother, arrived 2 years after James. Where their son was solemn and thoughtful like his father, Sarah was all energy and curiosity, keeping Grace busy from the moment she could crawl. As the children grew, Grace began teaching them at home, using books Caleb ordered from Eastern publishers. Word spread, and soon neighboring children joined them 3 days a week for lessons in the Nolans' front room. The informal school filled the teaching void Grace had once feared losing, while allowing her to remain at the heart of her family. Life wasn't without its sorrows. A particularly harsh winter took Martha Hollister, whose friendship Grace had come to cherish. And there was the terrifying summer when Comanche raiders swept through the region, forcing the scattered homesteaders to gather at the Nolan Ranch for safety. Caleb and the other men stood guard for 3 tense days until soldiers from Fort Griffin arrived to escort the families back to their homes. Through it all, the births and deaths, the bounty and scarcity, the peaceful times and those of danger, Grace never once regretted her decision to stay. The love between her and Caleb deepened with each passing season, growing stronger through shared joys and weathered storms. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard of a home now expanded to accommodate their growing family, Grace leaned against Caleb's shoulder. 10 years ago today, she mused. Did you ever imagine this? Caleb's arm tightened around her. I hoped, he admitted, but I wasn't sure you'd say yes when I asked you to stay. Best decision I ever made, Grace said, watching as James helped his little sister climb onto the back of a patient old pony. Even with all the hardships? Caleb asked. Grace thought of the challenges they'd faced, the loneliness of frontier life, the natural disasters, the constant work. But then she thought of the rewards their beautiful children, the home they'd built together, the love that sustained them. Especially with the hardships, she decided. They make the good times sweeter. Caleb pressed a kiss to her temple, a gesture that had become a familiar comfort over the years. Remember what I promised you that day I found you? Grace smiled, leaning into his embrace. that I'd wake up to a better morning. And did I keep my promise? He asked, his voice holding a hint of the vulnerability that still sometimes surfaced in quiet moments. Grace turned to face him, taking in the face she loved so well. A little more weathered now, a few strands of silver in his hair, but still the same steadfast Caleb who had carried her out of a dust storm and into a life better than any she could have imagined. Every single day, she assured him, reaching up to touch his cheek. Every morning with you is better than the last. As the Texas sun set behind them, painting the sky in gold and crimson, Grace Nolan counted her blessings: the husband who had saved her life and then made it worth living, the children who brought joy to every day, and the home they had built together out of love and determination. From fever and fear had come a lifetime of better mornings, just as Caleb had promised, and there were many more yet to come.